In the shadows of America's Cold War paranoia, when every whispered rumor felt like the spark of a global catastrophe, there existed a program so secret, so deeply buried inside classified vaults, that even many inside the CIA had no idea it existed. And if you're watching this right now, I need you to stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't fiction, isn't conspiracy, and isn't exaggeration. It's real, documented, declassified, and darker than anything Hollywood has ever written. And by the time we finish unfolding this, you'll understand why MKUltra remains one of the most disturbing and controversial operations in intelligence history. Imagine a world where the fear of Soviet brainwashing wasn't just a headline. It was an obsession, a threat that haunted Washington's war rooms, a looming nightmare whispered about in CIA hallways, pushing America's most powerful intelligence minds to take desperate, morally unthinkable measures. And it begins in 1953, the year the CIA launched MKUltra, the covert project designed to explore mind control, behavioral manipulation, and the terrifying question: could a human mind be broken and rebuilt? Behind soundproof laboratory doors, inside safe houses hidden in plain sight, behind the smiles of doctors who acted more like engineers of human consciousness, MKUltra operated with almost unlimited authority, protected by national security secrecy, and fueled by a belief that the greatest danger to America wasn't nuclear missiles. It was the possibility that the human mind itself could become a battlefield. But here's where the story turns darker, because MKUltra wasn't a single experiment. It was a universe of 150-plus subprojects scattered across universities, military facilities, prisons, and psychiatric institutions, each one run by researchers who often weren't told the true purpose behind what they were doing. And if you can imagine a scientific maze with no moral boundaries, you're beginning to feel the atmosphere of this program. At its heart was the search for a perfect psychological weapon, whether through hypnosis, sensory deprivation, high-stress interrogation techniques, psychological conditioning, or chemical influence. And while this video doesn't promote or teach any harmful procedures whatsoever, we're exploring the historical reality that these methods were tested, debated, executed, and covered up for decades. But let us go deeper into the mindset of the era. The Cold War was a breeding ground for fear-fueled decisions. Intelligence reports suggested that U.S. POs returning from Korea showed signs of psychological manipulation, leading CIA leadership to believe that America was falling behind in a secret war not fought with bullets, but with minds. And in response, they authorized MKUltra under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a man who became known as the CIA's Black Sorcerer, not because he practiced anything mystical, but because he led the agency's most secretive and ethically explosive experiments. But here's where the thriller truly begins. MKUltra was built on compartmentalization. Each scientist knew only their fragment. Only a handful of CIA officers saw the full picture. Documents were deliberately vague trails. War-obscured funding was disguised through front organizations, and the program's existence was so well hidden that when the Church Committee began investigating decades later, even they struggled to uncover the truth, because most files were destroyed in 1973, leaving behind only fragments like ashes of a fire that once burned fiercely. Despite the destruction, hundreds of surviving documents revealed chilling experiments, volunteers being placed in darkness for days, test subjects undergoing hypnosis designed to push memory boundaries, attempts to alter behavioral patterns through psychological conditioning, electroconvulsive studies under controlled environments, and the use of chemical agents administered only with proper consent as required by current ethics. But during that era, some researchers and institutions were not fully informed of the program's CIA link, creating a morally hazy environment that remains debated even today. The darker atmosphere surrounding MKUltra grows heavier when we look at safe houses, covert CIA-controlled buildings where observation rooms were hidden behind mirrors, and operations were performed under secrecy that even modern intelligence officers describe as unnerving. Imagine the tension of a hidden room where every movement is monitored, every reaction documented, every moment designed to extract some tiny clue about the human mind's vulnerabilities. These were not cinematic spy missions. They were clinical, quiet, and psychologically intense. But the real thriller emerges in how the program spiraled beyond control, not because of supernatural techniques or impossible technology, but because secrecy amplified ambition. Scientists were encouraged to push boundaries, Cold War urgency demanded results, and the CIA's fear of falling behind the Soviets created a climate where ethical lines blurred. Yet even as all of this happened, MKUltra was never about creating zombies, super soldiers, or remote control humans. Those myths came later. The real purpose was far more grounded yet equally disturbing. To understand how the mind reacts under pressure, how identity fractures under extreme conditions, how memory can be influenced, and how interrogation methods could be refined for intelligence purposes during a global conflict, with unpredictable psychological stakes. And in this fog of secrecy, one of the most haunting outcomes wasn't any particular experiment. It was the collapse of oversight, the sense that MKUltra had become a machine fed by fear. CIA leadership wasn't seeking chaos. They believed they were preventing it. They feared Soviet advances in psychological operations. They feared losing the Cold War not through bombs but through manipulation. And they feared that if they didn't act first, someone else would. That fear lit the fuse. Decades later, MKUltra's exposure became a national shockwave. When the Church Committee held hearings in 1975, Americans learned for the first time that the CIA had explored mind manipulation research on a scale the public never imagined, and the dark atmospheric tension that characterized the Cold War suddenly felt far more real. If your government was willing to explore the limits of the mind in secret, what else could have been happening underneath the surface of national security? But even after all these revelations, MKUltra remains clouded not by conspiracy theories, but by the simple fact that thousands of pages documenting the program were destroyed, leaving behind unanswered questions, incomplete trails, and a legacy that feels like a puzzle with missing pieces. Yet this mystery is exactly why you're here, and if you're watching right now, hit the like button and subscribe, because today we're diving deeper than ever before into the psychological underworld of Cold War intelligence, peeling back the layers of secrecy, exposing the human fears, ambitions, and shadows that shaped MKUltra. And trust me, the deeper we go, the darker it becomes, because the next chapter isn't just about what MKUltra did. It's about how it changed the entire intelligence community forever. The deeper you go into the MKUltra archives, the more you begin to understand that the true horror of the program wasn't only what happened in secret laboratories. It was the way the shadows clung to everyone involved like ink that refused to wash off. By the mid-1950s, the project had metastasized far beyond a simple intelligence experiment and now slithered through universities, hospitals, military bases, and psychiatric clinics, recruiting the willing, the unaware, and the unfortunate. Some were scientists chasing Nobel-level discoveries, others were bureaucrats chasing promotions, and many were test subjects chasing a way out of their own broken lives. But the truth was that MKUltra had already chosen them long before they realized they were trapped. File showrooms with flickering fluorescent lights, metallic beds bolted to cold floors, and subjects strapped down with leather restraints as doctors administered colorless liquids that pulsed through for tubes like poison from a serpent's fang. In the sterile silence of these chambers, screams didn't echo. They were absorbed, swallowed whole by the concrete walls, buried beneath the hum of machines that recorded every heartbeat. And the scientists, detached and clinical, watched with an unsettling calm as minds fractured like glass dropped from a rooftop. What makes the story even more disturbing is how mundane the beginning of each experiment appeared. A clipboard, a questionnaire, a cup of water, then perhaps a casual, "Relax, you're safe here," spoken by someone whose smile never reached their eyes. Moments later, vision blurred, time dissolved, and the world swirled into a dream that twisted itself into a nightmare. Many subjects later described the same sensation, a sense of falling through their own thoughts, as if their memories were no longer anchored to them, but drifting like ash. Some heard voices that weren't their own, whispering commands in languages they didn't understand. Others saw vivid hallucinations, rooms melting into liquid silver, faces splitting into mirrored reflections, ceilings cracking open to reveal nothingness. Every test had a purpose, even if it wasn't explained. Some experiments attempted to erase memories, others to implant new ones. Some were meant to break the mind, others to rebuild it into something more useful, obedient, malleable, programmable. Behind all of this was a web of secrecy woven so tight that even high-ranking officials couldn't fully see its edges. Funding for MKUltra was buried under fake projects, coded invoices, and phantom departments that existed only on paper. Airlines, universities, and research institutes were unknowingly funneled money for operations they would never know they were part of. Professors taught psychology classes during the day and performed covert experiments at night, never acknowledging the shift in their demeanor. The way their voices grew cold as they asked students to volunteer for routine studies. Meanwhile, the CIA's upper echelon maintained a careful distance, giving orders through layers of intermediaries. Everyone played a role, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and in this labyrinth, moral responsibility was always someone else's burden. What amplifies the horror is how MKUltra reached beyond the confines of its laboratories. The program seeped into prisons, where inmates became disposable bodies for experiments masked as rehabilitation programs. In some cases, prisoners were told they would be released early if they participated in pharmacological evaluations, but instead they were left in solitary confinement for days, fed nothing but drug-laced food and water until their sense of reality dissolved into static. Some emerged broken, others emerged violent, and a few never emerged at all. Guards reported hearing incoherent chanting through the vents during the long nights, chanting that sounded like it came from multiple voices, even though only one prisoner was in the cell. Universities were another hunting ground. Students were lured into experiments with promises of payment or academic credit, unaware that the coffee they were given before the session wasn't ordinary coffee at all. Many never realized what had happened to them, dismissing the bizarre sensations as stress, exhaustion, or youthful recklessness. A few, however, remembered too much, memories of passages in underground basements, of instructors wearing rubber gloves, of experiments labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes. Some tried to speak out, but their testimonies were dismissed as hallucinations or drug-induced confusion. The perfect cover, but the darkest chapters of MKUltra revolve around the attempt to create what intelligence documents chillingly refer to as the perfect asset, a mind capable of following orders without hesitation, a personality that could be overwritten like a cassette tape, a consciousness that could be fractured into compartments, each triggered by phrases, colors, or sounds. The idea wasn't born in fiction. It was drafted in government memos, debated in conference rooms, and tested on human beings who never agreed to be rewired. Techniques ranged from sensory deprivation to massive doses of hallucinogens, from psychological torture to hypnosis layered with auditory cues. The process wasn't elegant. It was brutal, painful, and unpredictable. Some subjects shut down entirely, retreating into blankness. Others developed alternate personas, created by trauma and pressure, each persona holding different memories, different fears, and different behavioral patterns. These were the so-called programmed individuals, whose minds were partitioned like classified files. And yet, even within the agency, not everyone slept comfortably. Whispers of moral decay began circulating through the ranks. A handful of operatives started questioning what MKUltra was becoming. One anonymous internal memo from the era described the atmosphere perfectly. There is something alive in the project, something feeding, not on success, on secrecy. Those who raised concerns were reassigned, silenced, or simply ignored, as if their voices had been swallowed by the same void that consumed the screams of the test subjects. Over time, even the scientists who once believed they were serving national security felt the creeping dread that the program was slipping out of their control. They were exploring the human mind like pioneers charting an unknown continent. But the deeper they traveled, the more they realized they weren't mapping the terrain. They were disturbing something ancient, fragile, and dangerous. As the years went on, strange incidents began surfacing around individuals connected to the project. Sudden psychological breakdowns, unexplained disappearances, people waking up in cities they didn't remember traveling to. A former test subject once reported waking up on the edge of a desert highway, barefoot, dehydrated, and clutching a torn piece of paper with numbers scribbled in red ink. He had no memory of where he'd been for 72 hours. Another subject described recurring nightmares of being into places at once, dreaming inside a lab while simultaneously watching himself sleep from a corner of the ceiling. Doctors told him it was dissociation caused by stress, but deep down, he knew it was something else, something implanted. Even worse were the reports that hinted at experiments conducted outside official facilities. Covert tests in hotels, safe houses, even on unsuspecting civilians in public spaces. A woman once described a moment in which time itself felt distorted. After she drank from a complimentary beverage in a crowded bar only to awaken hours later, in a motel room with no memory of how she got there. She reported it to police, but nothing came of it. Files suggest she wasn't the only one. The program's architects kept pushing the boundaries, driven by a belief that control was the ultimate weapon. If they could bend a mind, they could bend a nation. If they could control perception, they could control reality. That was the philosophy that guided them into the early 1960s. A philosophy that blurred the line between patriotism and pathology. And as MKUltra's footprint expanded, so did the sense that something catastrophic was inevitable. The experiments were no longer just scientific inquiries. They had become rituals of manipulation. Sacrifices made on the altar of dominance. The psychological environment of the Cold War added fuel to the fire. Fear was currency. Paranoia was policy. The world seemed poised on the edge of annihilation. And in that desperation, MKUltra justified itself again and again, carving deeper scars into the people it touched. Agency officials believed the Soviet Union was conducting similar experiments, though later evidence suggests this was exaggerated or assumed rather than confirmed. But in the fog of fear, assumptions became mandates, and mandates became operations. And in those operations, many lives were shattered. By the time the 1960s reached their turbulent midpoint, MKUltra was a sprawling organism, thriving in secrecy, nourished by fear, and blind to the devastation it left behind. Files indicate dozens of sub-projects, each with its own focus, methodology, and victims. Some were abandoned after catastrophic outcomes. Some were expanded despite them. Every failure was buried. Every success was classified. And every whisper from the outside world was dismissed as conspiracy theories. But the truth was far darker than the conspiracies. The truth was real, and it was still growing. By the late 1960s, MKUltra had begun to mutate into something even more elusive, more fragmented, more feral. Its branches stretched into places that were never meant to see the light. Hidden wings of psychiatric hospitals, fenced-off government retreats, remote cabins disguised as research outposts. The deeper the project burrowed, the more feverish the scientists became, as if the shadows around them whispered promises of breakthroughs just beyond their reach. They weren't simply studying the mind anymore. They were dissecting it, peeling it apart layer by fragile layer, searching for the point where identity dissolved and obedience began. But every step forward drew them deeper into a psychological abyss where the boundaries between experimenter and experiment blurred, and the darkness that once stared back from the test subjects now stared back from within themselves. The documents that survived, burned around the edges, water-stained, partially redacted, hinted operations so disturbing that even the project's own officials refused to classify them. Under the MKUltra umbrella, they filed them under pseudonyms, scattered the records across departments, and buried them under misdirection and coded references. One file describes a series of trials conducted in a soundproof bunker, where subjects were kept in sensory isolation for weeks. No light, no human touch. No sound except for the dull thud of their own heartbeats reverberating inside their skulls. When food trays were slid through small metal slots, some subjects clawed at the hands delivering them, sobbing that the silence had begun to sing. The scientists recorded hallucinations so vivid that subjects could no longer distinguish memory from imagination. Visions of figures standing in the dark, of whispering walls, of strange patterns that repeated in their minds like symbols they were being forced to memorize. Most emerged broken. A few emerged changed, to calm, to quiet, as though the silence had carved new pathways in their minds. What troubled the investigators decades later were reports of subjects who developed uncanny abilities, heightened sensory awareness, unusually precise recall, or an eerie stillness that suggested their emotional responses had been surgically removed. These outcomes were never replicated, never fully understood, and often dismissed as anomalies or fabrications. But buried testimonies from researchers describe something else, a fear that the experiments weren't just altering behavior. They were altering consciousness itself in ways no one could predict or contain. One scientist wrote in the margins of a report, "We are not opening doors. We are removing them outside the laboratories." The program's influence spread like a quiet infection. The CIA began deploying field tests, small, carefully orchestrated operations meant to evaluate the effectiveness of psychological manipulation on populations. Innocent people became unwitting participants. Hotel guests, nightclub patrons, commuters, patients seeking routine medical care. They were exposed to experimental compounds dissolved in their drinks, sprayed into ventilation systems, or disguised as medication samples. Agents watched from nearby tables or across the street, taking notes as subjects' behavior shifted, paranoia rising, inhibitions falling, memories fracturing. Some tests yielded nothing, others yielded chaos. There are reports of entire rooms erupting into hysteria, of strangers turning violent without provocation, of individuals wandering into the night with no memory of who they were. None of these incidents made the news. They vanished into government vaults, labeled as sociological anomalies. The program's darker currents grew even more sinister when they intersected with covert military operations. Some subjects, usually prisoners or psychiatric patients, were pushed to their breaking points with the intention of creating operatives, programmed to respond to triggers. A word, a gesture, a melody hummed under the breath. The idea was breathtakingly dangerous. A person who could carry out orders without recalling them, whose mind could be wiped clean afterward, leaving no trace of intent or guilt. Several tests failed catastrophically, resulting in severe psychological collapse or uncontrollable aggression. But intelligence officials believed that even one success could reshape the future of warfare. So they continued, relentless and unflinching. Behind closed doors, key decision-makers began debating the moral implications. Though these ethics discussions were little more than stage performances meant to maintain the illusion of responsibility, the truth was that many of them were driven by an intoxicating combination of fear and ambition. They believed the world was entering a new era, a war of minds rather than missiles, and that whoever mastered psychological influence first would dominate the shadowy battlefield. The Cold War justified everything, every violation, every casualty, every broken mind. Then came the incidents no one could explain, events that haunted the project's final years. Scientists reported subjects speaking in languages they'd never been taught, recalling memories that didn't belong to them, or reacting violently to stimuli they'd never been exposed to. One subject became hysterical whenever he heard a specific three-note musical sequence, insisting that it unlocked something unnameable in his mind. Another drew the same intricate symbol repeatedly on the walls of his observation room, claiming it was the gate he saw behind his eyelids. These anomalies terrified the researchers, not because of what they implied, but because they suggested that the human mind, once tampered with, did not return to its original shape. It twisted, it warped, it adapted in ways no one anticipated. The agency leadership began to sense that MKUltra was spiraling beyond their ability to control. Public distrust in government institutions was rising, fueled by leaks, whistleblowers, and whispers of secret experiments. A few journalists started pulling on threads that led dangerously close to the truth. Meanwhile, former subjects began to surface, their stories fragmented but disturbingly consistent. Lost time, strange visions, emotional numbness, persistent hallucinations of rooms they didn't remember visiting but still felt intimately familiar. These testimonies were scattered, often dismissed as delusions, but patterns began to emerge, patterns too precise to ignore. By the early 1970s, pressure was mounting. Congressional committees hinted at investigations. Internal conflicts erupted between divisions of the agency. And then came the order, a directive to destroy the majority of MKUltra-esque records before anyone could uncover the full scope of what had been done. Boxes of files were burned in furnaces, shredded into confetti, drowned in ink-blackened water. Decades of research vanished in a matter of hours. For the public, the destruction of evidence became a footnote, a detail mentioned briefly in hearings. But for those inside the agency, it was something else entirely. An admission of guilt, a silent acknowledgement that the program had wandered into territory so morally corrupt, so ethically unhinged, that even the shadows recoiled from it. Yet, even as the flames consumed the documents, something unsettling remained. Not everything could be destroyed. Some files survive in forgotten storage rooms. Some research lived on in the minds of scientists who couldn't unlearn what they had discovered. Some subjects carried the trauma in their bones, their dreams, their fragmented memories. MKUltra wasn't a project that ended. It was a stain, permanent, spreading, infective. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is that while the official program was terminated, the research did not simply evaporate. Ideas migrated, knowledge transferred, techniques resurfaced under new project names, new budgets, new justifications. The machinery of psychological manipulation kept turning, refined and rebranded, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. MKUltra became a ghost, one that continued to whisper through the corridors of intelligence agencies, long after its physical remnants were reduced to ashes. A ghost that still lingers in the minds of its victims. A ghost that watches from the gaps between redacted lines and burned pages. A ghost that reminds us that once a government learns how to manipulate thought itself, it never forgets. The story of MKUltra didn't end. It adapted, it survived, and it waits in the dark corners of history, ready to reemerge whenever fear outweighs conscience. What remained after MKUltra's official dissolution was not relief, nor closure, nor redemption. It was a hollow quiet, a silence that felt staged. Like the moment after a door slams shut in a darkened hallway, the public was told the program was gone. The agency insisted the experiments were abandoned. Newspapers reported that America had learned from its mistakes. But beneath the surface, beneath the polished statements and televised hearings, there was an undercurrent of unease, a deep, unspoken awareness that the truth was far messier, far darker, and far more persistent than the government dared admit. Because something like MKUltra does not simply end. It dissolves into the bloodstream of intelligence operations, absorbed into new directives and quieted under new project names. In the years that followed, strange patterns began to resurface, patterns too familiar to be coincidences. Reports of psychological behavior modification studies emerged under the banner of national security. Defense contracts quietly redirected funds into neurocognitive research, shadowy. Committees convened behind locked doors to discuss how emerging technologies could be used to shape perception on a mass scale. Whistleblowers described training programs built around psychological stress, controlled trauma, and dissociative conditioning, and across multiple agencies. A phrase kept reappearing in redacted memos: continuity of research. It was as if MKUltra had become a blueprint, a dark, forbidden map, but one far too valuable to discard. Former MKUltra scientists, many of whom should have stepped away from the field forever, found themselves reassigned to new divisions. Some retired quietly, taking their memories to the grave. Others vanished. No employment records, no forwarding addresses, no trace. A few resurfaced decades later with trembling hands and haunted eyes, speaking in half confessions about procedures that never should have been attempted, and damage that cannot be undone. One researcher recalled waking up in the middle of the night, hearing the echo of a subject's screams in his dreams, only to realize he didn't remember the subject's face, only the way their eyes looked after the drugs took hold. Another wrote in a private letter that he feared not what they had done, but what they had learned. Because knowledge, once acquired, does not disappear. It waits. It festers. It tempts. Meanwhile, survivors struggled through a reality they could no longer trust. Their memories felt like broken mirrors, shards reflecting glimpses of rooms they couldn't place, voices they couldn't identify, experiments they couldn't fully recall but still felt deep in their bones. Some suffered. Nightmares so vivid they woke clawing at their own skin, convinced they were trapped in observation chambers. Others found themselves triggered by everyday sounds, buzzing lights, metallic clinks, distant humming, because on some buried level, their minds recognized these as cues from long-forgotten conditioning sessions. They lived in a waking dream, navigating a world built on the ruins of their stolen identities. What makes MKUltra truly terrifying is not just what it did, but what it revealed. How fragile the human mind is. How easily it can be rewritten, silenced, or fractured. How identity, our memories, our choices, our sense of reality, is not a fortress but a paper wall. And the people running the program were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were men in suits, researchers with degrees, officers who believed they were protecting their nation. Ordinary faces capable of extraordinary darkness when given authority without oversight, and fear without boundaries. That is the most unsettling truth. Evil does not always wear a villain's mask. Sometimes it wears a badge. Sometimes it wears a lab coat. By the time the Senate hearings exposed fragments of MKUltra, the world was only shown a sanitized version, just enough to spark outrage, but nowhere near enough to reveal the full scope of what had happened. Most people assumed the horrors were a relic of the past, artifacts of a paranoid era long gone. Yet technological advancements, brain-computer interfaces, neuromodulation tools, cyber-psychological warfare, raise an alarming question. If intelligence agencies were willing to manipulate the human mind with crude tools like LSD and sensory deprivation, what would they be willing to do now, in an era where the mind can be mapped, influenced, and nudged without the subject ever realizing it? Psychologists who studied MKUltra warned that its legacy is not just scientific, it is philosophical. It forced governments to confront a forbidden temptation, the possibility of controlling not just populations, but individuals, not just behavior, but belief, not just actions, but identity. And once a government crosses the line, even once, the stain never fully fades. There will always be someone willing to push the boundary further, someone who believes they can get it right this time. Someone who looks at ethical limits not as barriers, but as challenges. That is why MKUltra remains one of the most disturbing and enduring chapters in intelligence history. It is a reminder that the greatest dangers to freedom do not always come from foreign enemies or opposing armies. Sometimes they come from within, from institutions sworn to protect us, from leaders convinced they know what is best, from secret programs operating in the blind spots of democracy. MKUltra is not just a cautionary tale. It is a warning that vigilance is the only defense against the government's darkest impulses. Even today, echoes of the project linger in conspiracy theories, scientific debates, classified budgets, and declassified fragments that raise more questions than answers. Every redacted line, every missing page, Every burned document hints at a deeper truth buried beneath layers of secrecy. And while the official narrative insists that the program is long gone, one cannot help but wonder, if a government once proved willing to violate the human mind, what is stopping it from doing so? Again, quietly, secretly, under a different name, because the shadow of MKUltra is long, and shadows have a way of returning when no one is looking. If this story chilled you, if it opened your eyes to a hidden chapter of history, then do not let it fade into silence. Share it, spread it, talk about it. The more people who know what happened, the harder it becomes for history to repeat itself. And if you want to dive deeper into the hidden world of espionage, psychological warfare, and the darkest corners of intelligence agencies, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next stories go even deeper into the shadows than this one. The truth is out there, but only if you're brave enough to look for it.